The family's failed writer. The Sullivan family had perfected the art of journalistic dismissal, treating my investigative reporting career like an extended hobby that I'd eventually outgrow once I got serious about stable employment that generated reliable income. At 28, I was still the family's cautionary tale about pursuing impractical writing dreams instead of secure careers that provided professional recognition and financial stability. "Casey's still playing reporter for that little online publication," Mom announced during Sunday dinner at the Oak Room, the upscale restaurant my brother Ryan had chosen to celebrate his latest promotion to regional sales manager at the pharmaceutical company. 3 years out of journalism school and still writing blog posts for websites nobody reads instead of finding real employment with actual companies. I stirred my butternut squash soup methodically, the familiar weight of family condescension settling on my shoulders like a press badge made of lead. My work at the Tribune wasn't writing blog posts. It was rigorous investigative journalism that had exposed corruption, influenced policy changes, and held powerful institutions accountable to the public. "Casey needs to face economic reality," Dad added, cutting his prime rib with the authority of someone who'd built a successful insurance agency through practical business development and client relationships. "Journalism is a dying industry. No job security, no advancement opportunities, no wealth-building potential. Just chasing stories that nobody cares about. No wealth-building potential." My articles had generated millions in advertising revenue, won National Journalism Awards, and established me as one of the most respected investigative reporters in the region. "Ryan just received another bonus for exceeding his sales targets," Mom said proudly, gesturing toward my brother who was glowing with the satisfaction of quantifiable professional achievement. "Real clients, real revenue, real career advancement. That's what professional success looks like." The contrast was never subtle. While Ryan's pharmaceutical sales generated impressive commissions and company recognition, my journalistic work was consistently characterized as freelance writing that would eventually be abandoned for practical employment. "Casey's problem," Uncle Mike said with the wisdom of someone who'd built a successful construction business, "is that journalism school filled their head with unrealistic expectations about writing careers. The newspaper industry is collapsing. Real careers require stable industries with growth potential." Stable industries. As if investigative journalism wasn't one of the most essential functions in a democratic society. "The media landscape is so unpredictable," Aunt Linda added knowledgeably, despite having no experience with publishing or journalism. "One day you're writing articles, the next day the publication goes bankrupt and you're unemployed. No security, no benefits, no long-term prospects." No long-term prospects. Despite my work being syndicated nationally and my investigations being cited by congressional committees and federal agencies. "What exactly does Casey do all day at that publication?" Cousin Michelle asked with genuine curiosity, as if my work was so foreign it required translation. "Writes investigative articles about local politics and business scandals," Ryan explained with the patient tone used for discussing impractical career choices. "Conspiracy theories about corruption and cover-ups. Very dramatic, but not exactly marketable to normal employers." Conspiracy theories. Because apparently documented evidence of public corruption was fictional storytelling rather than essential democratic accountability. "The problem with investigative journalism," Uncle Mike said with authority, "is that it's all sensationalism designed to create controversy. Casey wastes time on stories that probably aren't even true, instead of focusing on practical writing that generates real income. Stories that probably aren't even true, while my investigations had resulted in criminal prosecutions, policy reforms, and institutional changes at the highest levels of government. Casey could make excellent money in corporate communications," Mom suggested brightly, as if she'd discovered the perfect solution to my career confusion. "All that writing experience could be valuable for marketing and public relations. Real companies would pay well for professional content creation. Corporate communications. Using my investigative skills to promote companies rather than holding them accountable for misconduct. Or technical writing," Aunt Linda added helpfully. "Casey could write manuals and documentation for businesses. Apply writing skills to something that provides steady income and professional stability. Technical writing. Creating instruction manuals rather than exposing institutional corruption and protecting public interests. The important thing," Dad said with the finality of someone dispensing life wisdom, is that Casey eventually transitions into work that provides financial security and career advancement. This journalism hobby can't continue indefinitely. Journalism hobby. 7 years of rigorous journalism training and 3 years of professional investigative reporting reduced to recreational writing I'd eventually abandon for real employment. What they didn't know was that my hobby had produced investigations that were transforming public policy and exposing corruption at the highest levels of state and federal government. My recent series on pharmaceutical industry influence in state legislature had uncovered systematic bribery that was currently under FBI investigation. They also didn't know that the Pulitzer Prize Committee had been reviewing my work for the past 6 months, considering me for the most prestigious award in American journalism. But in their narrative, I remained the family member who'd wasted my education on impractical pursuits instead of building a stable career like Ryan's pharmaceutical sales success. Casey's editor keeps encouraging these investigation projects, Mom said with concern. These small publication managers don't understand that most writers need real jobs with steady paychecks, not journalism assignments that might not even get published. Journalism assignments that had been featured on front pages of major newspapers and broadcast on national television. Investigative reporting is so time-consuming, Uncle Mike agreed knowledgeably. You spend months on stories that might not even matter while corporate writers are producing content and generating revenue every day. Time-consuming investigations that had led to congressional hearings and federal criminal charges. The freelance lifestyle isn't sustainable long-term, Dad concluded with practical authority. Casey needs to start thinking about employee benefits, retirement planning, professional development. Real career building that requires institutional employment. Real career building that apparently couldn't include protecting democratic institutions and ensuring government accountability. The investigation breakthrough. What my family didn't understand was that my recent reporting had achieved what investigative journalists had been pursuing for decades. Comprehensive exposure of systematic corruption that spanned multiple levels of government and private industry. For 18 months, I'd been investigating connections between pharmaceutical companies, state legislators and regulatory agencies. These weren't isolated incidents. They were carefully documented patterns of influence peddling that undermined public health policy for corporate profit. The breakthrough had come 8 months earlier, during late-night research that had become routine since my family's dismissive comments about my work schedule. Casey stays in that office until all hours, Mom had complained during a recent family dinner. Normal people work regular business hours and come home to real lives. This obsession with investigation isn't healthy or profitable. Those late hours had led to the discovery that would define my journalistic career. While reviewing campaign finance records and legislative voting patterns, I'd identified systematic connections between pharmaceutical industry donations and specific regulatory decisions. More importantly, I documented these connections thoroughly enough to prove criminal conspiracy involving bribery, influence peddling, and regulatory capture. The investigation had been extraordinary. My series, Purchased Policy: How Pharmaceutical Money Shapes Public Health, had traced specific payments from drug companies to legislators who subsequently voted to weaken drug safety regulations. Editor Maria Rodriguez at the Tribune had been stunned by the scope of what I'd uncovered. Casey, she'd said after reviewing my latest findings, this represents exactly the kind of accountability journalism that democracy requires. You've documented corruption that could reach the highest levels of state government. The evidence seems almost too comprehensive to believe, I'd replied, still processing the magnitude of what I'd discovered. That's what breakthrough journalism looks like, Maria had smiled. Documentation so thorough that denial becomes impossible. Within weeks of my series publication, federal investigators had contacted the Tribune requesting all source materials and supporting documentation. The FBI had opened formal investigations into the officials and companies named in my articles. But the most significant recognition came when Dr. Patricia Chin, chair of the Pulitzer Prize Committee, had personally called to discuss my investigation and its impact on public policy. Ms. Sullivan, she'd said during our first conversation, your reporting represents exactly the kind of investigative excellence that the Pulitzer Prize was created to recognize. We want to honor your contribution to public accountability. Pulitzer Prize recognition. The pinnacle of journalistic achievement. An award that would establish my place among the most important reporters in American history. What kind of timeline are we discussing? I'd asked. The announcement will be made at next month's National Press Club ceremony. We're prepared to provide full institutional recognition for your democratic service. Full institutional recognition. The Pulitzer Committee was offering the journalism profession's highest honor, with national media coverage and career-defining validation. But my family remained convinced that my reporting was hobby writing that would eventually be abandoned for practical employment like Ryan's pharmaceutical sales career. Casey just needs to accept that the freelance phase is ending, Dad had said during last week's family dinner. Time to transition into real work that provides actual income and professional recognition. Actual income. The Pulitzer Prize would generate speaking opportunities, book deals, and journalism positions worth more than most traditional employment. Professional recognition. Pulitzer recognition represented the apex of journalistic achievement, with influence extending throughout media and government. But none of that mattered in my family's assessment, because investigative reporting wasn't real work like selling pharmaceuticals or running insurance agencies. The final irony came when I learned that this weekend's National Press Club Awards ceremony, where Dr. Chin would be announcing Pulitzer winners to the national journalism community, was being held at the same hotel where my family had planned their monthly celebration dinner. Let's go to the Grand Washington, Ryan had suggested during our planning call. They have that elegant dining room, and the atmosphere is perfect for celebrating my quarterly sales performance. The Grand Washington, where the journalism establishment's most influential figures would be gathered to discuss investigative excellence, including my Pulitzer Prize. Casey should come celebrate with us, Mom had added. They spend too much time isolated at that publication office. Family social events would be good for their professional development. Family social events would be good for my professional development. While the Pulitzer Committee prepared to announce that I'd won the most prestigious award in American journalism. The awards setup. The week before our family celebration dinner, the National Press Club Awards ceremony had transformed the Grand Washington into the epicenter of American journalism discussions. Distinguished editors, investigative reporters, and media executives gathered to review the year's most significant journalistic achievements and plan future investigative priorities. Dr. Chin had specifically requested that I attend the ceremony's final evening, when Pulitzer Prize announcements would be made to the assembled journalism community. Casey, she'd said during our planning call, your investigation represents the kind of democratic accountability that defines journalistic excellence. The media community needs to understand what you've accomplished. I'm honored to be considered, I'd replied, though I was nervous about the national attention ahead. You won't just be considered, Dr. Chin had smiled. You'll win. Your corruption investigation is exactly why we award these prizes, to recognize journalism that protects democratic institutions. Pulitzer Prize winner. My family's journalism hobby would be recognized as the year's most important investigative reporting. The timing couldn't have been more perfect, or more uncomfortable. My family's celebration dinner was scheduled for the same evening as my award announcement, in the same hotel where journalism leaders would be discussing my investigative excellence. We should get a nice table in the main dining room, Dad had suggested during our planning. Somewhere prominent where Ryan can network with other successful professionals who might be dining there. The main dining room where newspaper editors and journalism professors would be discussing my corruption investigation and Pulitzer recognition. Casey needs to dress appropriately for once, Mom had added with concern. No more of those rumpled reporter clothes. Real social events require professional appearance befitting successful careers. Professional appearance for an evening when I'd be recognized as the journalism profession's most honored investigative reporter. I'd spent the week trying to decide whether to tell my family about the Pulitzer or let them discover my achievement organically during their celebration of Ryan's pharmaceutical sales success. By Saturday I'd made my decision. For 3 years, they'd dismissed my investigative work as hobby writing while lecturing me about real career choices. They'd characterized my journalism as impractical storytelling that prevented me from finding legitimate employment. They'd made their assumptions about my worth and potential. Now they'd face the reality of what I'd actually accomplished while they weren't paying attention. The revelation. The Grand Washington's main dining room buzzed with quiet conversation as distinguished guests discussed media developments and journalistic achievements over elegant dinners. Following the ceremony's conclusion, journalism leaders from across the country had gathered to celebrate investigative excellence and plan collaborative accountability projects. My family arrived precisely at 7, dressed in their finest attire for Ryan's sales performance celebration. Dad had specifically requested a prominent table where other diners could appreciate our family's professional success. "This is perfect," Mom said as we were seated near the dining room's center. "So sophisticated, and I can see several other successful-looking families dining here tonight." Successful-looking families that included Pulitzer winners, newspaper publishers and journalism school deans. Ryan held court at the table's head, describing his latest pharmaceutical sales and client relationships while Dad ordered expensive wine to commemorate his achievements. "To real professional success," Dad announced, raising his glass in the traditional toast. "And to Ryan's continued excellence in providing valuable services that generate substantial income and company recognition." Real professional success. Valuable services that generate substantial income. While investigative journalists from around the country gathered to discuss reporting that protected democratic institutions. "Casey should really start thinking about transitioning into profitable work like Ryan's career," Mom said, continuing the familiar theme. "All this journalism time isn't leading anywhere economically viable or professionally prestigious. Journalism time that had produced investigations worthy of journalism's highest honor. I keep telling Casey that pharmaceutical companies need good writers," Ryan added helpfully. "They know all about research and documentation. Perfect for corporate communications positions that pay real money." Corporate communications positions. While the Pulitzer Committee prepared to honor my investigation into pharmaceutical industry corruption. "The important thing," Dad said, warming to his favorite lecture topic, "is that Casey eventually accepts that journalism careers aren't sustainable. They need corporate employment with reliable benefits and advancement opportunities." Corporate employment, while journalism leaders prepared to offer me the profession's most prestigious recognition. At that moment, Dr. Patricia Chin approached our table with several distinguished colleagues I recognized from journalism publications and media conferences. "Casey," she said warmly, "wonderful to see you here this evening." My family looked up with polite curiosity, assuming this was a casual social encounter. "Dr. Chin," I replied, my voice carefully professional. "I'd like you to meet some colleagues," Dr. Chin continued, her voice carrying the authority that commanded journalism institutions and media policy. "Dean Michael Roberts from Columbia Journalism School, Editor-in-Chief Sarah Martinez from The Washington Post, and Executive Director Jennifer Wong from the Committee to Protect Journalists." Columbia Journalism School. The Washington Post. Committee to Protect Journalists. Names that represented the pinnacle of American journalism education and practice. My family's faces showed confusion as they processed these introductions. "We've been discussing your remarkable investigative breakthrough," Dean Roberts said with genuine enthusiasm. "Your pharmaceutical corruption series could transform how we approach accountability journalism." Investigative breakthrough. Transform accountability journalism. Professional recognition at the highest levels of journalism education and practice. "I'm sorry," Ryan said uncertainly, "but who are you exactly?" "Dr. Patricia Chin, chair of the Pulitzer Prize Committee," she replied with crisp authority. "I'm here to announce that Casey has won this year's Pulitzer Prize for investigative reporting, one of the most significant journalism awards in American history." Chair of the Pulitzer Prize Committee. Pulitzer Prize for investigative reporting. Most significant journalism award. The family celebration had transformed into a journalism history announcement. "There seems to be some confusion," Dad said quickly, his voice defensive. "Casey writes articles for a small online publication. They don't have the experience for real journalism awards." Mr. Sullivan, Editor-in-Chief Martinez said with the quiet authority that filled newsrooms nationwide, "Casey has exposed systematic corruption that led to federal criminal investigations. Their work represents the kind of journalism that protects democratic institutions." Systematic corruption. Federal criminal investigations. Journalism that protects democratic institutions. The family's hobby writing was being recognized as essential democratic service. That's impossible, Mom said, her voice rising with confusion. Casey just writes blog posts about local politics. They don't do the kind of reporting that wins major awards. Mrs. Sullivan, Executive Director Wong said with institutional authority, Casey's investigation has triggered congressional hearings and FBI raids on state offices. This represents the kind of accountability journalism that exemplifies Pulitzer excellence. Congressional hearings. FBI raids. Accountability journalism exemplifying Pulitzer excellence. Casey's series will be studied in journalism schools for decades, Dr. Chen added, her voice carrying the weight of academic authority. We're featuring this investigation as a model of investigative methodology and democratic service. Studied in journalism schools for decades. Model of investigative methodology. Democratic service. Ryan sat in stunned silence as the implications became clear. His pharmaceutical sales success was being overshadowed by journalism that had exposed corruption in his own industry. Casey, Mom said desperately, turning toward me with tears forming, why didn't you tell us about any of this? We had no idea your writing was actually important. For 3 years I tried to explain my investigative work while they dismissed it as hobby blogging. I described my corruption discoveries while they lectured me about finding real employment. I tried to tell you, I said quietly, my voice carrying clearly through the dining room's sudden attention. Every time I mentioned federal investigations or policy impact, someone changed the subject or told me to find a real job. But Casey, Dad said, his voice breaking, we didn't understand that journalism could be this significant. You never explained that you were doing real investigative reporting. I explained it constantly, I replied, my voice steady despite the adrenaline. You decided it wasn't important because it didn't generate sales commissions like Ryan's pharmaceutical career. The truth settled over the table like expensive wine, impossible to ignore or dismiss. Dr. Chen placed award materials on the table. Casey, if you're ready, I'd like to make the official announcement to our colleagues here tonight. Before I could respond, she'd moved toward the podium that had been set up for journalism presentations. Ladies and gentlemen, Dr. Chen said, her voice commanding the attention of the journalism community's most distinguished leaders, I have the honor of announcing this year's most significant Pulitzer Prize. The dining room fell silent as journalism leaders turned toward the committee chair's announcement. Casey Sullivan has conducted investigative reporting that exposed systematic corruption and protected democratic institutions, the kind of journalism the Pulitzer Prize was created to honor. The applause was immediate and sustained. Newspaper editors, investigative reporters, and journalism educators rose to their feet in recognition of work that would influence democratic accountability for generations. As the recognition continued, I looked toward my family's table. Mom and Dad sat frozen in their seats, their assumptions about my career completely shattered. Ryan managed a weak smile, but his eyes showed shock at discovering that his impractical sibling was being celebrated by people he'd never imagined could exist. The celebration of Ryan's pharmaceutical sales had become the announcement of my journalism breakthrough. The aftermath. The 72 hours following Dr. Chen's announcement transformed my family relationships and my understanding of journalistic recognition in ways that seemed impossible just days earlier. By Monday morning, media publications had featured my investigation, journalism schools had requested speaking engagements, and news organizations worldwide had inquired about my reporting methods. Ryan called first, his voice mixing genuine pride with obvious bewilderment. Casey, I had no idea your writing was this important. Why didn't you ever explain that you were exposing actual corruption that could affect entire industries? I tried to explain it constantly, I replied. Every time I mentioned federal investigations or congressional hearings, someone told me to find real work that paid better. But we thought you were just writing opinion pieces about local politics, not investigative journalism that could influence federal policy. Investigative reporting is journalism. It always was. The conversation marked the beginning of a fundamental shift in how Ryan viewed professional achievement and public service. Mom called next, her voice heavy with regret and confusion. Casey, I feel terrible about how we've been treating your work. We just didn't understand that journalism could be this significant to society. You didn't want to understand, I said gently. Every time I tried to share my investigations, you changed the subject to Ryan's sales performance. We thought we were encouraging you toward more profitable employment. We didn't realize you were already doing the most important work imaginable." Dad's conversation was the most difficult, his voice carrying the weight of someone whose fundamental assumptions had collapsed. "Casey, I owe you an enormous apology. I spent years telling you to abandon journalism for real work, while you were developing investigations that could protect democratic institutions. You weren't trying to hurt me," I said. "You just couldn't imagine that reporting could be more important than traditional corporate careers. How do I make up for 3 years of dismissing the most important work you'll ever do? By supporting what I'm actually accomplishing instead of what you think I should be accomplishing." The journalism community's response was overwhelming. Within a week, I'd received job offers from major newspapers across 3 continents, book deal proposals worth substantial advances, and university teaching opportunities that would establish me as one of the field's leading investigative specialists. Editor Rodriguez helped me navigate the sudden attention and career opportunities. "Casey," she said during one of our planning sessions, "your family's reaction isn't unusual. Most people can't conceptualize investigative journalism until they see the institutional recognition it receives. They made me feel like my work was pointless hobby writing for 3 years. Your work was never pointless. Their understanding was limited. There's a difference." The most significant change came in my relationship with professional confidence. For years, my family's dismissive attitudes had made me question whether journalism was valuable or sustainable as a serious career. Now, surrounded by journalism leaders who understood the implications of my work, I realized that my investigative reporting was exactly as important as I'd always believed, regardless of my family's ability to recognize its value. 6 months later, my corruption investigation had led to criminal convictions of 12 state officials and comprehensive reform of pharmaceutical industry lobbying regulations. Journalism schools worldwide had incorporated my investigative methods into their curricula. My family's understanding of my career had evolved dramatically. Ryan regularly brought colleagues to my speaking engagements, proudly introducing me as my sibling, the Pulitzer winner. Mom and Dad had become enthusiastic advocates for press freedom and investigative journalism funding. But the most important transformation was internal. I'd learned that journalistic worth isn't determined by family recognition, and investigative significance doesn't require unanimous approval from people who lack expertise in media fields. During a recent family dinner, Dad offered career advice about managing my journalism prominence. "Casey should consider all these newspaper offers carefully," he suggested. "Some of these positions could provide substantial influence on public policy." "I'm focused on continuing investigative work rather than maximizing institutional influence," I replied. "The quality of the reporting matters most." "That's exactly the kind of thinking that makes you an exceptional journalist," he said with genuine pride. The conversation ended without argument or defensiveness. His opinion was valuable input now, not authority that could undermine my professional confidence. Looking around the table at people who had shaped my childhood and challenged my adulthood, I felt something I'd never experienced during family dinners: complete peace with my chosen career path and absolute confidence in my journalistic contributions. The young reporter who had desperately wanted family approval for their investigative interests had evolved into a journalist whose work was protecting democratic institutions nationwide. My family's recognition was gratifying, but it wasn't the source of my professional identity. The journalism community's validation confirmed what I'd always known: investigative reporting is valuable whether or not everyone understands its importance. I'd learned that some achievements transcend family approval, some careers exceed conventional understanding, and some contributions to democratic accountability matter regardless of who recognizes their significance. The journalism that had been dismissed as hobby writing was now influencing public policy, protecting democratic institutions, and establishing me as a leader in investigative reporting.